All right, so in this video, I'm going to be talking about Joe Rogan's most disliked podcast. You know, the episode he received the most backlash for from his own audience, and people started questioning if he sold out. So Joe had to go on to address it multiple times and apologize for it because people were so upset with him. They thought he'd finally been compromised by the globalists and it was all over. But he corrected things and people were pretty happy with his response. So that's what I'm going to be talking about in this video. I'm going to be going over what led up to this podcast, why it was so disliked, and then how Joe handled it afterwards to redeem himself. So the podcast I'm referring to here is number 1236 with Jack Dorsey, you know, the former CEO of Twitter. And this video isn't on YouTube anymore, but when it was, I believe it had like 7,000 likes and 70 to 80,000 dislikes, and pretty much all the comments were negative. Because going into this podcast, Joe's fans figured he was going to grill him and ask him some tough questions about the censorship going on Twitter and try to get to the bottom of things and get some answers, and they probably figured it'd be more confrontational, but it was basically the opposite of that. Joe seemed really friendly with him. He didn't ask him any tough questions. He brought up censorship a couple times, but he didn't dig too deep into it. You know, he mostly just talked to Jack about how difficult it must be to run Twitter and all the responsibility that comes with it. And during the podcast, it sounded like Joe was pretty happy with the way Jack's been running things, which was surprising to a lot of his fans, obviously, especially considering around this time, censorship was a huge topic of conversation because just a few months before this, in late 2018, Joe's friend Alex Jones was completely deplatformed. So people figured during the Jack Dorsey podcast, Joe would spend most of his time questioning him about that, and he would try to get to the bottom of things and defend Alex and figure out why he was banned. But that didn't really happen. Joe did ask him a couple questions about that, which we'll get to, but it was not what people expected. And I think one of the reasons for that was because a few months before he was deplatformed was when the Sandy Hook families started to sue him, which was obviously a huge news story. He was being talked about like every day. He was the media's number one target pretty much, and I'm sure that's what led to him getting deplatformed. So since he was taking so much heat at the time, he wanted to go on Joe's podcast to try to defend himself and explain himself. But because of that, Joe didn't want to have him on. It sounded like he just didn't want to deal with the shit he'd get for it. And also, he wasn't too happy about the Sandy Hook stuff.
He's trying to come back on, and I just don't know if I could do it.
Oh, come on. Let him come on. They're shutting him down.
They are shutting him down, but the problem is he's still on trial. This whole trial that's going on with Sandy Hook. All that shit has to be resolved first. It's the thing to say if you're really into conspiracies. But this is the problem with these conspiracies. They say things they don't know are true, and they say them like they're true. Now, this is fine
but
if you just talk.
Why is that an issue?
It's fine if you. It's not an issue if you're talking about the Illuminati. If you're talking about your kid getting shot,
right? If
your kid's dead, and someone says, "Hey, man, Tom Smith on the radio saying you're full of shit, you're a crisis actor, and your kid's not dead." I mean, you're crying every night. You wake up in the middle of the night crying because some guy on pill. But you are a little bit.
No, I'm just defending his right to be Alex Jones.
Yes,
that's all.
And I defend that as well.
And I defend
with Bill
David
Maher
Allen Coe.
And this podcast was before the Jack Dorsey one, and also Joe was upset that Alex was making up stuff about him as well. I think because Joe hasn't had him on in a while and he wasn't defending him and he wasn't having him back on at the time, then Alex started saying that Joe's family was being threatened by the government to stop talking about conspiracy theories.
George, that's a part of the conspiratorial thinking that's a real problem. It's like saying you know. He said some shit about me. He said some shit about me that's 100% not true. He said that the government threatened my family to stop talking about conspiracy theories. No, nobody threatened my family. No one, zero, never happened, did not happen. It is fake. It is a lie. Someone told it to him, I guess, or he says someone told it to him. It didn't happen. So that's me.
I understand.
But do you understand like how frustrating that is? This is a minor thing. Him lying, not lying. Okay, he says someone told him. I believe he's telling the truth. But it's not true. He could have called me. He's got my number, man. Call me. So he didn't even bother calling me. Joe, I'm about to go live from Austin, Texas. I need to know, did someone threaten your family? Stop talking about the moon landing and Bigfoot.
Sturgill said you had that down.
Fucking imagine they're going to threaten you. You got to stop talking about Bigfoot, man.
And it seems like Joe and Alex usually go through this cycle where Joe will have him on and the podcast does really well. It gets a ton of views. People love it. And then a few years go by and people start to question, like, oh, maybe Joe's scared to have him back on again. And then once Alex starts taking shit from the media, usually because of the Sandy Hook stuff, that's when he really wants to get back on because he needs to defend himself. But then Joe doesn't want to do it because he doesn't want to take any shit. You know, he just wants to wait for all that to blow over. So they usually have some kind of disagreement with that. Like, this also happened last year when all the Sandy Hook stuff was heating up and the trial was going on. Alex was out to eat with Joe and he started begging him to get back on the podcast.
Dinner about a month ago, last time I hung out with him, and it's his pet peeve not to bring it up. And I just said, man, it really helped me with this upcoming court case because the whole media is against me. If I could get on there and explain things. And he just said, Alex, you got, there's too much craziness going on. Let's just get through this. We'll talk about it later. So I'm not really worried about it. Obviously, I'm the big interview he'd want. He even said, listen, you're like nuclear weapons. On the courage scale, Steven Crowder's a 10, Alex Jones is a 10, and Joe Rogan's an 8. And I'll take an 8 all day over our enemies that are at a 0.
Of course.
And so I'm nothing but thankful to Joe for all the heat he's taken having me on.
So that was more recently, but it seemed like the same kind of thing was going on when Joe had Jack Dorsey on his podcast. It seemed like Alex and him were not on the best terms. So I think that's probably at least part of the reason why Joe was more reluctant to defend Alex and question why he's banned when he's talking to Jack. But since Alex was just deplatformed and Joe's friends with him, and Joe spends a lot of time criticizing censorship and big tech and talking about how important free speech is, his audience expected a lot more from this, and they're really disappointed when they realized Joe wasn't going to press them too much on any of these issues. Like, Joe spent most of the time just talking about how difficult it must be to run Twitter, and he just kept asking him, what's that like? It must be so hard. How do you manage it all?
There's not a lot of other ones like it. There's just this one thing. Like, how does that happen? Yeah. Where this one thing sort of gets adopted by everybody and takes over, and then just becomes this overwhelmingly massive platform. Twitter, there's nothing on the scale of distributing information in a quick, short, 280 character form like that.
We I don't think we could plan for it. I don't think we could necessarily build for that.
When did you realize, or when did you realize, I'm sure you're aware of it, when did you realize that this was almost out of your control in terms of like the scale of it?
There wasn't one moment. There wasn't one moment that
going back to the responsibility that you guys have, and you in particular, like when this became what it is now, and when it became evident that it became this gigantic way of changing the way human beings communicate with each other, was there ever any regret? Now, you as a CEO, as a guy who's running this thing, what has this experience been like for you? Because I got to imagine that it wasn't anything that you predicted. No one predicted Twitter, right?
Yeah.
So to all of a sudden have this responsibility.
Twitter changed everything. I mean,
and you're a young guy. How old are you?
42.
That's young. To be in control of that much, just a pathway for people to get their thoughts out, but a really a powerful one, an unprecedented method of distributing information. It's really nothing ever been like this before.
No, and it won't. This mode of communicating will not go away.
So Joe is just more interested in hearing about what it's like to be responsible for Twitter, pretty much. And I think he kept asking questions like this because he can kind of relate to it with his podcast. Like, when he finally does ask him about Alex Jones, he segues into it by kind of comparing his position with his podcast to Jack's position with Twitter, because they get the same kind of criticism when it comes to allowing controversial people to use their platform. And there's really no winning because either way, people are going to be upset, obviously.
There's this signal that I'm sending out to millions and millions of people, and then people are like, well, you have a responsibility. I'm like, oh, great. Well, I didn't want that. I didn't want a responsibility to what I distribute. I just wanted to be able to have a freak show. Just talk to people. Like, whatever, like there's certain people that I have on, whether it's Alex Jones or anyone that's controversial, where people will get mad. Why are you giving this person a platform? I go, okay, I didn't think about it that way, and I don't think that's what I'm doing. I think I'm talking to people, and you can listen.
Yeah.
But it's giving that person a platform, because they're saying, well, no, they'll tone down their, like Milo Yiannopoulos. That was one of the arguments people gave me. Like, he toned down his platform when he was on your show so he could get more people to pay attention to him. I'm like, okay, but he also talked about that was one of the reasons why he was exposed, was my show, because he talked about that it's okay to have sex with underage boys if they're gay, because there's like a mentor relationship between the older gay man and the younger, and people are like, what the f are you talking about? And that was a big part of why he's kind of been removed from the public conversation. Like, what is the responsibility of these platforms, whether it's YouTube or Twitter or anyone? Like, what is their responsibility to decide whether or not someone should or shouldn't be able to speak? And this is a thing that I've been struggling with, and I bounce around inside my own head, and I see that you guys struggle with it, and pretty much everyone does. YouTube does, and it's it is a hugely significant discussion that is left to a very relatively small amount of people. And this is why this discussion of what is social media, is it something that everybody has a right to, or is it something that should be restricted to only people that are willing to behave and carry themselves in a certain way?
I believe it's something that everyone has a right to.
Everyone has a right to, but you still ban people. Like Alex Jones. You guys were the last guys to keep Alex Jones on the platform. You were the last ones.
Yeah.
And I believe you hung in there until he started harassing you personally, right?
No. He did not.
He came to your house. He begged. No.
No. He did very different things on our platform versus the others.
Okay.
So we saw this domino effect over a weekend of one platform banning him, and then another in very, very quick succession.
Right.
And people, I think, would have assumed that we would just have followed suit, but he didn't violate our terms of service.
Right.
And afterwards, he did, and we have a policy, and if there's a violation, we take enforcement actions.
What you're saying? So let's use it in terms of him saying that Sandy Hook was fake. He did not say that on the platform. He did not say that on Twitter. He only said that on his show.
I don't know all the mediums he said it in.
What did he do?
But what we're looking at is a conduct and what he did on our platform.
So what did he do on your platform that was that you all were in agreement that this is enough?
I'm not sure what the actual violations were, but we have a set number of actions, and if they keep getting if an account keeps violating terms of service, ultimately it leads to permanent suspension. And when all the other platforms were taking him off, we didn't find those. We didn't find those violations, and they weren't reported. But again, it goes back to.
So those were definitely the toughest questions Joe had for him during the podcast. And of course, he didn't really give an answer. He didn't even know why Alex was banned. So most people in the comment section were critical of this podcast, and they thought Joe was deleting comments for a while because some of the top ones were hidden for some reason. And then also people were coming up with theories, like since Cash App, which is owned by Jack Dorsey, is a big sponsor of Joe's podcast, they thought that's maybe why Joe didn't want to ask him any tough questions. And then obviously this didn't make anything better with Alex Jones. He was really pissed off after this podcast, and I couldn't find any videos of him talking about it, unfortunately, but I did find this article describing his reaction to it. They said, finally, Jones responded to Rogan by upping his accusations, claiming that Rogan was being used by Silicon Valley as a power source, a victim of his own success used to spread propaganda. Jones also denied that he'd ever made his infamous Sandy Hook comments, while simultaneously asserting his right to say them. Jones then used a poorly thought out allegory in which Joe Rogan is a whale and Jones is a giant squid with a tentacle wrapped around the whale's head. He then proceeded to squeeze his hands repeatedly in an oddly sexual manner and confidently stated, "Jesus told me to destroy Joe Rogan." So then after all this, Joe addressed all the criticism on a Twitter and Instagram post, and then he also talked about it on his podcast.
But you're like, no, but this is the one that's in control of the narrative. This is the one that's in control of social media. It's this far left-leaning ideology, and the other part gets pushed aside. That's a very bad situation for all of us, because there has to be conversation. There has to be debate, because if there's not, it just shores up the differences between two people, and they can hate each other even more. I did not take that into account, and I've up. That's my mistake. That is my mistake when I made that podcast. But I didn't take it easy on him because I didn't want to discuss those issues. I just didn't think enough of it in advance. I'm not as involved in it as other people are. I'm aware that there's censorship in social media. I'm aware. My ideas going into that conversation were more about how insane this method is for distributing information. For the people that have been banned, and for the people that were fans of the people that were banned, I can understand why they'd be upset at me. It has nothing to do with any preconceived notions that I had. It's just how the conversation took place. That's all it is. And if you felt left down by that, you didn't feel like it was as extensive enough, I'm more than willing to do it and go further into it, and we're going to. We'll concentrate on that. We're just going to work out a date. So my humblest apologies to all of you. I'm not trying to let anybody down. I always try to do my best. That's it. And also, here's another clear one. No one tells me what to do. There's no secret person behind the scenes. I should have prepared more. I should have thought about it more. But I didn't realize like how upset people would be.
And he also talked about Alex a little bit as well. He said he got in touch with him, and Alex apologized for saying that Joe's family was contacted by the government to stop talking about conspiracy theories. But then he said, Alex went on to say that Joe Rogan's now working for the CIA, and he's repeating George Soros talking points. So he probably made that up once this Jack Dorsey podcast happened, because this clearly upset him even more.
I definitely think about it differently if I wasn't friends with Alex, but I would also think about it differently if he hadn't made shit up about me. He said that I was told to stop talking about conspiracies or they threaten my family. That's 100% horseshit. And he has my phone number. He could have called me. I called him after I heard about it. He told me that someone told him that I talked to the person who told him that. I'm like, this is bananas. Like, you out of your mind? Call me. This is so stupid. You think I'm not talking about whatever, fill in the blank, whatever ridiculous conspiracy. The Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, whatever it is. I'm not talking about that because the government threatened my family. That is wrong. It's ridiculous. And now you put it out there. So Alex Jones went on afterwards and he apologized and corrected it. Then recently, because I haven't had him on the podcast, he decided to start saying that I work for the CIA and that I'm George Soros talking points, which I don't even know what these talking points are. Talking points about him in specific. Not talking to anybody. No one's giving me talking points. Not George Soros.
That's not what Eddie Bravo has been saying. I
Eddie
mean,
Bravo
he got good information through
Eddie
Joey
Bravo
Diaz.
doesn't even say that, so stop. This is what I missed when I was headed into that conversation. I missed how other people looked at that guy and what he stands for. I don't think it's correct. I think it's way more complicated. I think it's an insane business to run. And I don't think he really knew why Alex Jones was banned or why anybody else was banned. I don't think he really knew. I think he's dealing with a giant corporation.
What were you saying? He runs a couple different companies. He's not.
Yes.
He's not sitting at Twitter's offices every day.
That's another thing that Alex Jones brought up today. That he sponsors the podcast through the Cash App, which he also runs. It's 100% true. But I think we talked about it on the podcast. We even talked about the Cash App being a sponsor and about how it's helped Justin Wren's fight for the forgotten charity. So Alex Jones erroneously said that I didn't mention it. So we did mention it. It's worth mentioning. And Alex Jones is having to like respond to people that want to know if I've seen what Alex Jones has said about me lately is one of the weirder things that I've dealt with. Because, first of all, I've always had good dealings with Alex in person to person. But he's obviously in a world of shit right now. There's a lot going on with him with this Sandy Hook stuff. And he wasn't entirely honest with me about what he had said about Sandy Hook. Maybe he didn't remember. Maybe he was trying to phrase it in a way other than the way I interpreted it when I saw the videos. But there's a Media Matters video that shows all the time where he said that Sandy Hook was fake. This is very complicated to me. And this is one of the reasons why I struggled with bringing him back on the podcast.
So after that Jack Dorsey podcast, Tim Pool was somebody who made a video about it and talked about how disappointed he was in it and everything. And then Joe invited him on the podcast for his first appearance, and they talked about it a little bit.
Argue that, you know, what Jack is trying to do with Twitter, or I don't say him personally, but what Twitter is trying to do is what? Create like a comfy, padded neon room for the kids to hang out at? No, the real world is harsh.
Yeah, I think what they're trying to do, and I don't want to speak for him, but I think they're trying to engineer the conversation to be more polite and civil.
Says who?
Exactly.
You know, whose definition?
That's a good point.
And I see so many of these people who just, they wield power and they're unaccountable. And
well, it's also you don't recognize the consequences of telling people what they can and can't do.
So since everybody was so upset about the first podcast, Jack agreed to do another one, and he would bring on the lady who's in charge of all the policy over at Twitter to talk about all the issues that people have with it. And I guess Joe figured that Tim was more informed on this stuff than he was, and he would do a better job of discussing these topics with them. So he invited him on the podcast as well. But before that, you know, between Jack Dorsey's first appearance and his second one, Joe actually did end up having Alex Jones on. And of course, it was a classic episode. There's so many good moments and memes to come from it, which I could probably talk about in another video. But I'm just going to play the beginning of it where they talk about some of the stuff that was going on between them.
We should tell everybody that you and I had, well, first of all, we had a long conversation on the phone, which led to just a lot of talking.
You were
about
driving to
things.
Vegas a few weeks ago. We talked like an hour and a half.
And then we decided to do another podcast. And We cleared the air on the phone. We decided to clear the air more on a podcast. There's a lot of things going on. I told you a long time ago that I would have you back on, and in the interest of being completely honest, I was hesitant to do it, not because I didn't want to talk to you, but because of just the amount of bullshit that I get from people that get angry that you and I are friends. That why give that guy a platform? That's the big one. Why give that guy a platform? That's the big one. But you and I have always had a good time together. We've always had fun together. Our only problems have always been when we're not, like if you're talking about me or if I'm talking about you, not if we're talking to each other. It's the distance has been the problem.
It's the telephone.
The lack of communication. The lack of communication has been the problem. The thing that people are upset about you, the thing that we wanted to talk about, like quick to get it over with, or not quick, but just to get it
up front.
Up front. That's the best way to
or
put it.
Or to be misrepresented.
Yes. Is the Sandy Hook stuff.
Yes.
Yeah. So ever say that you think it's not real?
Yes, I did.
But now you do think it's real.
Because I learned some of the anomalies were not accurate.
That's a problem with all this conspiracy shit, right? Because the conspiracy theory stuff, the people that want to believe, they believe in conspiracies with everything. And I think there's a certain percent, and we talked about this just a few minutes ago.
Yeah, when I started getting accused 4 years ago, a couple years into it, and I said, no, I think it happened. Then people that I had interviewed and things started saying, he's involved, he's one of them.
Because you are now saying that it happened, they thought that you'd been compromised.
Yes, and then I was realizing,
this is how it works.
A certain percentage of people are schizophrenic.
Exactly.
And then they just think everything's a conspiracy.
Well, this is the thing about conspiracies. It's very attractive to people that are schizophrenic. Schizophrenic people think everything's a conspiracy from top to bottom. Every single interaction that people have is some sort of a stage event that's trying to take them down or control this or mind control that. That's a big factor in a lot of this conspiracy theory shit is mental illness.
When I started having people come to the office saying that I'm Bo Bridges or that I'm Jeff Bridges or that I am
you're Bill Hicks.
Bill Hicks, and people in restaurants screaming, F you, Bill, we know it's you. It's kind of like Dan Rather, the guy threatening me. What's the signal, Dan? What's the signal?
So Joe and Alex were able to work things out for the time being at least. And I wonder how much that has to do with the Jack Dorsey podcast and all the backlash that Joe got from that. Because having Alex on right after that obviously would help calm that down a little bit. Because also it seemed like Joe was just sick of doing the back and forth with Alex, where Alex says some crazy stuff about him and then Joe responds on his podcast and they don't really talk it out in person. So I think he just wanted to put an end to that. And then also just a week after this is when Joe did his second podcast with Jack Dorsey and Tim Pool and Vija, the head of legal and policy over at Twitter. And Tim Pool just grilled them for like 3.5 hours about the censorship going on at Twitter.
What we're trying to drive is opportunity for every single person to be able to speak freely on the platform. And
that's absolutely not true. You don't allow hate speech. So free speech is not on your platform.
I said
speak freely.
Enable everyone, create the opportunity for everyone to speak on our service.
Unless it's hate speech, right?
And in part of that, the recognition that we're taking action on is that when some people encounter particular conduct, that we see them wanting to remove themselves from the platform completely, which goes against that principle of...
In many of these cases, what happens is we will force someone to acknowledge that their tweet violated our rules, force them to delete that tweet before they can get back on the platform.
And I would rather die than do that.
Yeah, so like Jordan Peterson says, Twitter is a rat hole in the final analysis, but it's Elon Musk's problem now. And so far, he's chosen to keep Alex Jones banned. He actually said he's never coming back. So a lot has changed on Twitter, but Alex Jones, I don't think is ever returning. But for the Jack Dorsey, Joe Rogan saga, Joe was obviously able to redeem himself, and people were definitely happy with the second podcast that he did. So that's about it for this video. Thanks for watching. Make sure you leave me a comment. Let me know what you think about all this. And then make sure you go check out my Patreon account. There's a bunch of content up there. I post every week. And I have videos about the downfall of Milo Yiannopoulos, which Joe was talking about a little bit earlier in this video. If you want to hear about that, make sure you check it out. And then also I have a video about the Kramer, Michael Richards N-word rant and all the fallout from that. And then also the degeneracy of Ari Shaffir, or like some of Joe Rogan's cringiest podcasts, which people don't really talk about and you probably haven't heard of. So make sure you go check out the Patreon to support the channel and get extra content. And then hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and I'll catch you at the next video.